Hi everyone, welcome back to our conversation series about documentation and planning. In our last conversation, we discussed ways to be able to observe and record our ideas for documentation. Today, we're going to explore how to make meaning of these artifacts and interpret or use them for ideas for reflection and for dialogue in our practice. Joanne, I think you're going to kick us off about as we start to talk about meaning making today.
Thank you, Kathy. I will do that. We often talk about pedagogical documentation, and people say, what is pedagogical documentation? How does pedagogical documentation differ from just documentation? It's this piece that makes a document pedagogical. That the meaning-making part, the part that, Wendy Lee's talked about analysis again. Susan Stacy has talked about interpretation, but this is where you really take what you've observed and what you've recorded and you make meaning of it. Documentation becomes pedagogical when educators have the time to reflect on the event, on the child, and on the situation to better understand, what has happened. So as Susan Stacy says in her book, Pedagogical Documentation, says, in my own work on emergent curriculum and the cycle of inquiry, I offer up the idea of a space to pause and think. And I refer to this as the missing middle, because in North American settings, the opportunity to pause in this reflective space is often missing, and this is a component that takes time. As we talked about at the end of the last podcast, sometimes reflection can be on your own, and oftentimes as an educator you'll take that picture and you'll take whatever recording you have, whatever written documentation you have, and you will start thinking about it. But there is value in that being shared with other people and having that conversation with other people. A really good place that people often start is with the pedagogical partner. So the pedagogical partner, as we saw last time where Simradeep started to have people reflect and engaged in that reflection with them. So reflection and developing this missing middle can be done on your own, and it can be done as you share your observations and recording with other people. So again, we often refer to the missing middle. Educators have become very good at taking photos and writing descriptions of what they've seen. They are very good storytellers, as Wendy Lee has pointed out. But the process of analysis and reflecting deeply on what they have seen and heard becomes the next part and is what that missing middle is. Often this is missing for a couple of reasons. First of all, educators may not have time. But we have seen that reflection does not just need to happen in the moment. Those little scribbles that you have on the paper, on that sticky note, you can add details to that and create a description of that particular experience that you can come back to and reflect on afterwards. Another reason for this is the time and context for educators to reflect together. Sometimes the experience of reflecting on a moment or a photo or an experience with a trusted colleague can be the opportunity to consider the child and their learning from different perspectives, maybe one that you hadn't considered before. So that sharing can be a valuable component to this. So we need to move beyond the simple photo to articulate learning, dispositions, relationships by asking, what is the child thinking? What connections are they making? What are they learning? This includes what is happening outside of the picture, outside of the frame. So, part of the context and part of the meaning that we're developing here. So educators can reflect on what they're learning in flight as a way to deepen their thinking. How does this observation fit with your image of the child? What does it tell you about dispositions? What does it tell you about your use of time, space, materials, or your participation in the experience? The thinking lens also provides another way to engage in reflection, and it provides a diverse range of questions that an educator can ask themselves about a particular moment or observation, or a facilitator or colleague can help by providing some of these questions as a way to consider reflection and reflecting on that moment, and how that documentation might emerge. Oftentimes, I think, Kathy, we've seen in settings where pedagogical partners are working with educators and program leaders, using headings such as notice, name, and nurture. Some people like what, so what, now what. But those are ways to start thinking about that moment, and about that observation a little bit more deeply. Pedagogical documentation is a new way of thinking and wondering together between the act of observation and planning what you're going to do next. So, but more importantly, this deep thinking leads naturally to the next step, an opportunity for learning for the child. What's next? How can I nurture this interest or this learning for the child? How can this be shared with family and even with the child? But before we move into planning, I think we want to talk a little bit more about this whole process of analysis.
In our conversation with Wendy Lee, we were so fortunate to have her share with us the three parts of a learning story. As she was doing this in the conversation, we quickly recognized that this is really the way that we can think about the documentation and the planning process, because she so thoughtfully guides us through this. Now, in your learning communities, we've incorporated some articles from Wendy, so that this will further highlight what she's talking about, and it'll be quite specific to what those three parts are. She also has agreed to share with us some tips for writing learning stories if that's the approach that you wish to explore. For others, they may wish to use other approaches, but we would really encourage you to think about the process that Wendy and Margaret walk us through, because it can be used for any type of documentation.
Well, I think Wendy Lee has made the point on several occasions that there are three parts, and that it's just really important to think about those three parts. And oftentimes, learning stories may reflect them as three pieces, or it may flow into one. But what the important thing to remember for educators here is that this is a process. There's a beginning point of, the observation and the description. There is a middle part that is that analysis or that interpretation, and then what you do with where you take it from there into the planning part. And really paying attention to that middle part is what this process is about, and what Wendy's going to describe to us.
So if you're starting with your story, I always think the title is so important. But you won't write the title at the beginning. You'll write it when you finish the story. It'll emerge out of the story. I mean, we don't want what we're trying to move away from people doing things like block play, I mean, without any inspiration or any connection. Like, you want a story that actually, it might be, I can do it. That might be the title in the end of the story. Or it might be a quiet moment. Or it could be just like the light bulb. But it's always deeply connected to the story. It's like a literacy hook for the child. So I think the titles do act as hooks for children, and also for parents as well. So the first part of the learning story is the story, and it is just your observation, your curious engagement as to what the child is doing. And when it's written by someone who's genuinely and deeply curious about the child, it will be visible to all. And we've also moved, one of the important moves that took place, and again, it's not a rigid rule, but more often than not, it's now rare to see a learning story that's not written directly to the child. And one of the really big pluses of writing directly to the child is it helps people who have been writing observations for a long time to move into a different space of connection. And I think it's interesting because for a long time I would read stories and I'd think, oh, it's like the emperor's not wearing his clothes, because inside the learning story was just an observation, actually. It wasn't a learning story, because they were in that old style of being the distant observer and trying to be objective. And I think I think all the research is clear. Someone can debate this with me, but I think the research is clear that none of us are objective, that we all bring our own values and our own beliefs. The moment we pick up the pen, the moment we see something that we think is important, is the moment of something that our subjectivity, something we valued, takes effect. And I think that this notion of writing the story directly to the child takes teachers into sort of capturing something, a deeper engagement and deeper emotion, sort of the concentration, the excitement, the intent. And I think that's a very fabulous thing that happens in the writing of the story. So you're focusing on something that is significant to the child, and it doesn't have to be long. Actually, some stories are one sentence, and actually the photos will tell it all, and the unpacking will make it so rich when you come to write the analysis and think about what you're going to do next. So you're giving the story context often. You're also writing who was involved in that particular story, and you're particularly talking about the child's role. What did they do? What was so interesting for you? What made you stop and consider and think, I need to write this story? And actually, I think it's interesting that in the first instance in New Zealand, when we were writing stories, people felt they had to carry pens with them wherever they went in order to record everything. And then they soon realized that actually when stories were important stories, they were embedded in their memory and they could easily write them at the end of the day. In fact, some of us will be able to write stories from 20 years ago because they are so vivid in our minds. And I think that that power of realizing, that you could just watch closely, intently, and be engaged and write the story later has been a very powerful move for writing beautiful stories. And I also think that it is very fabulous to have the child's voice. So sometimes you capture a particular moment and you just know, you remember it. But I think sometimes it's quite good to record if it's appropriate. I don't see that happening. Wouldn't want to see that happening as an ongoing always. But I think sometimes it is really good to document children's voices and to include them, because when you do include voices, it brings a depth to the learning story, which is lovely. And I can remember there was a story written quite a long time ago, and the teacher had written down the words. He said it was about dinosaurs, and he was reading it to his mother, and he got to this bit and he said, "And Mum, those are the exact words I said." And the absolute delight on this child's face as he expressed this to his mother. So we all know the value of that. So the story, and when I think about the length, sometimes people write long stories and they're fabulous. And I certainly don't say don't do that, because sometimes you feel you need to write that story because there is so much you want to share. And other times you're going to write a really short story. And I do think writing a great short story is an art. It's an art to bring the significant moment of that child's learning into view. I think that's that's an art that's well worth developing. So yeah, I'd certainly, give that a big go. And the thing is, when you write with joy and love and respect and valuing the child and their curiosity, you're going to write a great story. Like, if you're there, present. The other thing I would say about writing stories, sometimes people, teachers have, educators have come up to me and they've told me something and I've gone, wow, that is an incredible, delightful, wonderful story. You must write it. And I'd love to see it. Okay? And then they bring the story back to me and I read it and I go, I'm a little bit in shock, because I realize the story that was told and the story that was written are two completely different artifacts. Like this, what I'm reading now has lost its emotion, lost its connection, lost its joy, because the person's gone into this intense, I have to write this down and I'm not feeling confident about writing, or I'm trying to make it professional or whatever. And with teachers, when I've said to teachers, okay, like what you told me was just an absolute delight, and I was so excited about the story that you told me, but what you've written is not that story. So I want you to take your phone and I want you to go to text, as if you're sending me a text message, push that microphone and speak into that microphone what you spoke to me about that story. And then send that to your computer as the basis for your story, because that's the writing that will touch the heart of the parent and the child when they read it. And it's such a little thing, but actually for some people, it's very, very helpful in helping them bring the story to life, rather than, this sort of torturous writing that, and let's face it, some people have had bad experiences at school, and they think in their minds they can't write because someone's told them probably that they can't write. Actually, they can speak, they can write, and I think that the more that people recognise the power of their own writing and their own voice, the stronger they become in writing learning stories. Well, I don't think there's one way to do this, but sometimes it's one powerful image, or sometimes it might be a sequence of images, but you are not just sitting the images there for no reason at all. The images are there to be part of the story. And they're an important context for the child in understanding and retelling the story. So if people think about the child when they're taking these photos and the parents, and they think about the retelling, I think they will be more able to connect with what's going to be appropriate for that story. That's another thing of disheartening. You look at many of these online platforms, when they print them out, all these little tiny photos. No one can see what's happening in them. They have no possibility for any real engagement and real joy. Really? No. So I think, actually, I haven't got one there. I was just thinking I might have a story right here beside me, but I haven't. So I think the photos are very, very important. And I think sometimes it's also, if a teacher sees another teacher or educator deeply engaged with a child, take a photo. It might be an important opportunity to include in the photo in their learning story, because I think that's another important thing, is to have visibility sometimes, not always, but sometimes, of the educators with the children when they're writing a particular story. Yeah. Okay. Now, for me, the second part of the learning story, the analysis, the recognizing, what's of value here is for me the most important part of the learning story. It's what changes that description, that story, into what was a lovely story, into assessment. And it's at this point it changes from just a story. And I think it's also important in the analysis to write in the first person, to say, I chose this story because, or I noticed, and this is why I wanted to write about the story, or also to be a little bit tentative about the learning, not to make some absolute fixed ideas, because you're not in the child's head. So be a little bit realistic about how you document the learning. I noticed the strong curiosity and the problem solving that you were engaged in, or you might say these moments, as I remember Julie said when she was writing about a little boy called Dennis, she said, these moments are why I love teaching, and went on to describe his particular learning. So I think when you come to do that analysis, you can, for new teachers, it's lovely to read a story and work collectively with a group to brainstorm potential learning. I think that's a lovely way to help teachers who are in training to think about all the possibilities. And at the end of the day, the person who wrote the story will have the deepest and the greatest understanding about what's most important. And I'm not an advocate of writing pages and pages of analysis. I think you can. I always feel the analysis is often bigger than the story, and I absolutely agree with that. But I think you can get to a point where it's sort of paralysis by analysis, and you lose people. So keeping it focused and sometimes keeping it short is also good, to bring what you think is the most important learning in that moment for that child, and particularly for that story, whether it's about social competence, or whether it's about kindness, or whether it's about the child's contribution or emerging knowledge that the child's got. So many possibilities, and so much of that recognizing is going to be based on your values and your curriculum and what's important. So you're doing not only the how or the learning dispositions, but you're also thinking about the curriculum. And it might be literacy and maths and all those sorts of things. And I have to say that I'm sort of all over the place, but I have to say that I got into a space following Te Whāriki of really focusing strongly just on dispositions and making that the core area of analysis because of the power of them. And I think on reflection it was a bit naive, because you can't have one without the other. They are woven together. You can't have dispositions without some form of topic or curriculum or aspect of what. So I always encourage teachers now to think about both and to weave them together in their analysis. I know from my own experience of working with teachers that the more teachers write and analyze stories and think about learning and think about their pedagogy in relationship to this, the more articulate they become in talking about these ideas. And I think that is one of the very powerful things, because when you're writing, you're being quite thoughtful about what did I see, what was underlying this, what was this about. This thoughtfulness and this reflectiveness is a very powerful foundation for building an articulate teacher. I also want to say that it's really important to keep the narrative strong, because some people can get into bullet points and start listing things, And what happens, it becomes disconnected to the story. Because when you're writing the analysis, you are weaving the story into the analysis so that no one can miss this child's experience in it, so that it's deeply connected to the story. That is really, really important. Otherwise, it just becomes like, as they do online, learning tags. Totally meaningless, and no one really connects with them at all. And I think that, like in the early days of Te Whāriki, people used to just, maybe I'm a bit ingenious to say, dumped in statements, just copy and paste from the document into the learning story when it came to something like the learning. Actually, the parents say they don't read it. They just stop reading it because it's meaningless. But when it's woven into their child's experience, that learning episode, that's when it transforms and makes a difference. But it is a way of, I think it's a way of deepening your understanding of your curriculum document, your framework, by thinking deeply about what's in this that actually makes some deep connections to the things that we value in our curriculum. Yeah. Okay, now the third part. Actually, the third part is an interesting space. It has been an interesting space over time, because at some stage I used to say, oh, maybe you don't need to do the third part. Who knows what's next, sort of thing. Which is probably says a lot about me and my teaching in terms of wanting to be responsive. But actually, we have become more committed to the notion of thinking about the third space. So it's changed now. The third space is no longer what next, long gone. Opportunities and possibilities are still there, but it tended to mean people started to list activities and ideas, and we didn't really want people to go into that space. So now we're using the wording we're tending to use is more like, how can we stretch? How can we stretch and nurture Amanda's learning? So it's just, and shifting some of that into a different space to think about how might we progress these ideas, because we know progress is pretty challenging. Or where do we think this learning could lead? So being tentative, but being open to possibilities. So, and I think that's been, and the other important thing that happened was the movement from the teacher or educator who's writing the story to this third part is about the learning community. So it changes from I to we. So where can this learning lead as a community? What can we do to support this learning? How can we, as a learning community, collectively stretch this learning, nurture this learning? No, it's not necessarily done in dialogue, but it's shared with others. Okay? Because, we've tried as much as possible to ensure the flow of learning stories and not find too many blocks for people writing stories. So, and nothing's set in concrete anyway. Everything keeps developing. But we do want, that's why we want people reading each other's stories. So I can see, what I need to do to support this child as well. It's not just the teacher who wrote the story. And we've got a few other things we've been doing in that space, but we'll leave that for another day. But I do think that, I have come to the point of realizing that this is what sets learning stories as a so-called, I don't like to use the word planning because it's sort of such an archaic planning a house like what's going to happen. But it is, without doubt, this is the space where the individual child's planning is taking place. So when we talk about in our curriculum, our whakatauki, let the uniqueness of the child guide our work, this is what we mean. So we're listening to their story, we're analysing, and we're thinking about what they might like to do. They might have some ideas themselves about what they'd like to do, which could be incorporated in this part of the learning story. But it is the space that acknowledges and values the individual child's learning journey. And it's through connecting stories across time that you begin to see the continuity.
Wendy does such a beautiful job of talking about this process with us. What we so appreciated was the opportunity to be able to connect with Wendy, and we kind of thought about it afterwards. It's like having tea with Wendy Lee. And she really leans into the conversation, and we hope that in your learning communities, as you debrief these conversations and dissect them, that you really have a chance to go into what Wendy is talking about using the resources that we've provided you. In part one of her process, she really describes nicely the aspects of observation and recording. She's specific to the title. She talks about clearly about, describing those moments, telling that story, and she is a beautiful storyteller. In part two, she really explored the interpretation and identification of the learning. That's where we've really seen an evolution, and Wendy talks about that, the evolution of their learning and thinking in the learning stories, about being very significantly pulling out those learning pieces. And so when we are thinking about interpreting, that is the missing middle piece that Joanne had spoken of earlier in our conversation today. And then in part three, she talks about the opportunities and possibilities, which aligns so nicely with our own flight framework here in Alberta.
So in our next conversation, we're actually going to spend a little bit more time on talking the documentation. We've talked about reflection. We've talked about how important interpretation is. Next, we're going to talk about and actually see in practice how people talk through the documentation. And then after we explore that, we will move very naturally into opportunities and possibilities, or as Wendy likes to call it, stretching what the child is learning. So see you next time.